All right, so Brain Balance is a local service. We help, at the end of the day, it's all about brain training. It's all about driving connections and increasing brain connectivity. We have 3 centers locally here in San Diego, one here in San Diego near Poway, one in Chula Vista, and one in Encinitas. And at any time during this presentation, if you think of a question, not only can you drop in the chat, but you can always email us. Maybe after the presentation you have questions, just feel free to get to our website. You can connect it there. And Brain Balance helps with a lot of different things by driving those brain connections. By kind of diving into the root causes, we help with focus, anxiety, stress management, memory, performance, decision making, a lot of things that are big, important goals for our kids, for our clients. We work on all these different things by having a really comprehensive program. So our program targets these specific areas: emotionality, reading and writing as well, social skills, academics, motor coordination, and behaviors. I'm going to skip ahead to this slide. We do so by looking at primitive reflexes, core muscles, body control, visual processing, synchronization, things like that. And really, we drive change bottom up. So with that in mind, we've invited Alyson tonight to kind of speak to us about developmental language and all the things that she's been researching on, all the things that she's an expert in. Because while Brain Balance can help by improving cognition, oftentimes we see our kids, they have areas that need to be targeted a little bit more, right? And so we just love to learn more about other people in this space. And today we're going to learn a lot about language. Alyson, you want to take it away?
All right, let me share my screen. Oops, I didn't do it. See, Ricky, you told me I was going to be able to do this. But...
Oh,
there it is. Found it.
Okay.
Oh, it says I can't share because you're sharing.
Oh, my bad. Let's stop that.
All right. There we go. All right. That works, right?
Yeah.
Well, hi, everybody. My name is Alyson Abel, and I am looking for my mouse. I am an associate professor in the School of Speech, Language, and Hearing Sciences at San Diego State University. I'm also the interim associate dean in the College of Health and Human Services, also at San Diego State University. I'm the principal investigator of the Language Learning Lab at SDSU. And I want to start by just making clear that I have no actual or potential conflict of interest in relation to this presentation, but also to disclose some relevant financial relationships. Currently, I receive research support from the National Institutes of Health, National Institute of Deafness and Communication Disorders, and the Department of Education Office of Special Education Programming, which are both a mouthful, which is why we use abbreviations. And I'm also an employee of San Diego State University. What this does not tell you is that I'm a person who loves everything child language and loves talking about child language. And so this is a great opportunity for me to spend an evening talking about the thing that has driven my entire career thus far. Before I start, I want to give credit for this presentation that this is modified from the U.S. Raising Awareness of Developmental Language Disorder Community presentation. That was developed in recognition of DLD Awareness Day. So we have a number of lead authors here, including myself and a number of others. And towards the bottom, I have starred Jean Tai, who I'm drawing some material from later, and I've provided a citation to one of her references. But I cannot take full credit for some of this work. I need to make sure that the other authors and contributors receive acknowledgement as well. So I want to start off by giving you a little information about what I'm talking about when I talk about DLD. So there are at least 2 children in every classroom that are 12 times more likely than their peers to have difficulties with reading, spelling, and math, that by adulthood are 3 times more likely than their peers to experience clinical depression due to language difficulties, and by adulthood are 6 times more likely than their peers to experience clinical levels of anxiety due to language difficulties. And there's an internationally accepted term that we can use to describe these children, which is developmental language disorder, or DLD. Developmental language disorder starts with the D for developmental, which means that it is not acquired. this is present at birth. So when I say that it's not acquired, meaning that developmental language disorder is not due to a brain injury, or it's not due to any other stroke or anything that has happened since birth. It is present at birth, even though we don't know what the direct cause is yet. L for language. Language, when I'm speaking about language, I want to be clear, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, that I'm trying to differentiate language from the speech system. So in my field of speech language pathology, when I'm talking about the speech system, I'm really talking about the motor speech and the motor process by which we get the mouth together and we produce sounds. That's the speech system. For language, when I talk about language, it's really the use of words, and that could be spoken words, written words, or signed words to communicate with others. And so and I'll talk more about what language is like in a few minutes, but that's going to be individual words, putting words together to make sentences, putting sentences together to make conversations or to make stories, reading and writing, and everything related to vocabulary, grammar, etc. So language is different from speech, which means that DLD is not merely a speech disorder, although some children may have speech impairment, which we'll talk about later. But a lot of our kids with DLD have intact speech skills. They can produce speech without any difficulty, but their language is affected. And the last D is for disorder. And what I mean by this is that it's not a delay, it's a lifelong condition. So one of the things I'll show later is that there is a delay involved in DLD. The onset of language starts later than we would expect, but it doesn't catch up. So these are kids who may start talking later, but their language skills are not going to catch up with their peers with typical language. Instead, this is going to be with them through life. Children don't grow out of DLD, and they're going to learn how to adapt, and by working with a number of professionals, they'll learn strategies to help them be successful, but are not going to recover, so to speak, from DLD. This is one of my favorite quotes. Developmental language disorder is a neurodevelopmental condition that emerges in early childhood and frequently persists into adulthood. People with DLD have significant difficulty learning, understanding, and using spoken language. And I asterisk to say also signed language. We do know that DLD would affect people who use signed language as well. I'm going to put up here a bunch of different terms that have been used to refer to DLD. And the reason I'm doing this is for a number of different reasons. One is because we know that different professionals use different terms to refer to the same thing here. And so I want to throw out some words, some terms that you may have heard in the past or you may hear in the future. So that when you hear these terms, you think, okay, this is the same people that I'm talking about that I heard Alyson talk about. Also, when we talk about the difference between diagnostic terminology and terminology to refer to these children, that may differ from the way that schools and insurance companies will handle the same diagnosis because, again, a difference in terms. So we hear the other reason is that if you ever want to look into what DLD is and you stumble on the research terminology, you may see different terms used over the many decades that we've been investigating this disorder, but we're still referring to the same kids. So in the research terminology, you may hear terms like developmental aphasia or dysphagia, which is a much older term, and more recently, specific language impairment, primary language impairment, or language learning impairment. Those are all referring to the same group of kids with a specific language deficit in their language system that is not caused by anything acquired. In the clinical terminology, you may hear people use terms like language disorder, specific learning disorder, and if you're working in the insurance billing area space, you may hear things like expressive language disorder or expressive and receptive language disorder. In the educational space, you may hear terms like developmental delay or speech or language impairment or specific learning disability, because those are the diagnostic categories or the eligibility categories for Individuals with Disabilities Education Act or IDEA. So even though you may not get the exact term DLD in some of these spaces, we're all generally talking about the same kids. So again, I just wanted to make sure that you have access to this different information, because knowing this will help you navigate across different professions and different spaces when you're thinking about what DLD is. So what I want to spend a good amount of time doing today is talking about what DLD looks like. And we use here an analogy of a wildflower garden, because the wildflower garden doesn't look the same at all times. Some flowers will die off, new ones will sprout. Some flowers will blossom in the spring and others not until late summer. As the season change, so does the garden. And we can think of DLD in the same way. For individuals with DLD, their language areas of strengths and weaknesses will change not only over time, but with development, but it will also be based on the specific context, similar to a garden. We also know that DLD is very heterogeneous. No two children with DLD look alike. And so we'll see different patterns of strengths and weaknesses. And so I just want to go over some of what we know and what we understand we might see in kids with DLD. What I'm going to talk about here, and I'm going to introduce these terms and give some generalizations of areas we may see weakness in the areas of phonology, writing, grammar, reading, vocabulary, and discourse. And like I said, I'm going to highlight some things we might see in children with DLD in these different areas. But as I go through these, please keep in mind that there's a lot of variability in DLD. Not all children will show all these symptoms, and some language patterns may still just be used more slowly, less often, or less accurately than appears with typical language development. Also, and this is critical, and I'm going to say it multiple times, these are only symptoms of DLD when they are not dialect appropriate. So for children who use different dialects than standard American English, some of these, there are forms that are acceptable and appropriate in dialect that also look like some of these forms. So I just want to be clear that I'm mostly referring here to standard American English dialect speakers. When I go through these, please feel free to chat. And if Ricky, if you feel like it's a good opportunity to interrupt me to answer any of these questions, please don't hesitate to do so. I'm going to start by talking about phonology. Phonology is the sounds of language. This is different from speech when I just introduced speech, because where we think of speech has to do with the motor structure and the ability to get the mouth together to coordinate to make sounds and to make sounds clearer or less clear. Phonology is how sounds work within the language system, not how they're produced, but how they actually work to make words. So when we think about phonology in terms of language, we think that we put phonemes or individual sounds together to make words. So words like cat are made up of 3 different sounds. And technically words like fish are also made up of 3 different sounds, although there's 4 different letters. And so we have to think about how those work to make individual sounds, but also how they work to make different parts of language. So if I go from a singular cat to a plural cats, I put 1 letter on the end or 1 sound, and that changes the entire word from 1 to a plural. So phonology works with other parts of language to tell us about how words and how grammar works. Difficulty with phonology will often look like delayed speech development. So we will see some kids who have trouble producing speech sounds. It could be because they have trouble with the motor control to produce the speech sounds. It could be that they have difficulty understanding and using phonology. So what we'll see is kids who have difficulty with phonology may look like delayed speech development, unclear speech or unintelligible speech, or sustained difficulty in producing particular sounds. It's important to remember that most kids with DLD have no difficulty learning and using sounds, but some still show deficits in phonology. Critically, as children grow older and enter the school years, we may see difficulty relating sounds to letters. And as I'm sure you can imagine, this will impact learning how to read and write. Because if you don't know how sounds work, then it's going to be hard to understand that that letter C actually can have a S sound or a K sound. And in order to do that, that's a skill that you need to acquire in order to gain literacy skills. So this will have downstream effects on most aspects of education. Another area is actually my primary area of research interest is in vocabulary. And when I'm talking about vocabulary here, I refer to acquiring or learning new vocabulary, using vocabulary, and understanding vocabulary. Vocabulary carries the most meaning information when we communicate. So we can get away, and kids get away for a long time with communicating with 1 word, because you can often communicate a lot with just a single word. And then you can also think about when we use sentences and you had to pay per word. People would send words with a lot of meaning information because you can get a lot of meaning across just by individual words. The vocabulary deficits that we see in DLD change throughout the lifespan. Early on, we tend to see a late onset of expressive vocabulary. So where most kids will start producing individual words around 1 year or 12 to 15 months. With kids with DLD, we may not see individual words till 18, 24 months or later. We also see a limited use of vocabulary. We see kids relying heavily on words like this, that, go, get, or do in spoken and sign language. These are really powerful words that cover a lot of ground without kids having to have a very explicit vocabulary. You can say this, a child can walk around saying this and refer to a lot of things, especially if they combine it with something like a point or a gesture. And they can really communicate a lot, but they're not using a lot of words. So children may rely heavily on words that are generic words that can kind of cover a lot of ground in communication, rather than specific words like dog, cat, window, cereal, cookie, right? If the child is staring at the pantry or the refrigerator, rather than saying what they want by name, they may say this, that. And again, they're relying heavily on a small subset of words. This is much more common in kids with DLD than in kids who have more typical language development patterns. Vocabulary deficits also appear in using words with multiple meanings. That in there with the multiple meanings. So if you take a word like bank, which has the bank of a river and a bank where you store money, that's going to be harder for our kids with DLD because it's harder for them to understand that you're putting multiple meanings with one set of phonemes or one set of sounds. One of the biggest things that we see is that kids with DLD have trouble learning new vocabulary. And in fact, it takes children with DLD 3 to 5 times more exposures to a word in order to learn it compared to their typically developing peers, to kids with peers with typical language. So they may have to hear a brand new word like blanket 5 times more than another child in order to start learning what that word means. Grammar is also one of the most commonly affected areas of language in DLD. And I can tell you that most speech language pathologists also are grammar, because grammar is a tricky part of language that you either love it or I tend to love grammar. So I like talking about grammar as well. So here, when I'm talking about grammar, I'm going to use the word grammar to refer to different parts of language: morphology, syntax. So just a brief overview for morphology, that's going to be rules about how to choose a word to fit different language functions. So if you remember when I said you take cat, S on it, and that changes cat into the plural, from a singular to a plural, that S is a morpheme. It gives us really powerful information about grammar. The same thing with the sound ed, or the letters ed. If I say I walk and I walked, just by putting that ed at the end of walked tells us a lot about when something happened. So that's a morpheme. It's something that we add to a word to give us more grammar information. And I'm also going to talk about grammar in terms of syntax, which is more traditionally what we think about, which is going to be sentence level grammar. How do you know that the dog bit the girl is different from the girl bit the dog? Because word order matters. Those are both grammar functions, but also that you're not allowed to say the girl dog bit, because that is a violation of grammar and how we use words. So I'll use grammar to talk about both the word level grammar, but also the sentence level grammar. Early in development, we find that young children with DLD are delayed when they start putting two words together, which is the earliest type of syntax in grammar. So really what we see is that when kids start combining words together, it's very meaningful in how they're doing it. And we tend to see things like a noun and a verb together, like doggy go, mommy sit, want candy, probably not candy, want cookie, whatever that is. We tend to see nouns and verbs put together in meaningful ways because children are starting to understand how early grammar works. But our kids with DLD do this late. So we usually see this around 18 months, maybe into the early young 20-month age in children with typical language development. But our kids with DLD may not be combining words until 24, 30, or 36 months, which is going to put them behind in terms of grammar development. When children have developed further and are using longer or more complex sentences, we also see missing or incorrect words. So we may hear questions like, Josh, come over and play, where they like to eat, I went to practice, so I was done with homework. So in those cases, there are meaningful words missing that really change the way the sentences are being said, and they affect the grammar of the sentence. This stage occurs in children with typical language development also, but they usually are able to do this successfully by kindergarten, but kids with DLD will make these errors for a longer period of time. We will also hear awkward productions. And so those would mostly occur with complex sentences and with question forms, because complex sentences and question forms in English are some of the most challenging areas of grammar. And so those examples that I gave you before, Josh, come over and play, it sounds mostly right, but not all the way right. And so that's what I mean by an awkward sentence production, where they like to eat, missing a word. Again, it's mostly right, but it's not all the way right. And then in that complex sentence example I gave you, I went to practice, so I was done with homework. Almost everything's right except that word so. It's not quite the right conjunction. And so again, that's going to be something that we may see early on in kids with typical language development also, but they tend to acquire it pretty early, and these errors persist in our kids with DLD. We also see that kids with DLD will leave off important word endings that are critical for grammar. So if we go back to my example, like I walk versus I walked, we will see that kids with DLD are more likely to not use that ED and say I walked. And that means that they're saying I walk to refer to the present tense, but also I walk to refer to the past tense if they don't understand how they have to use that ED, which is going to make it hard for us to understand what they're saying. We'll also see it in sentences like the dog is walk, when they should be saying the dog is walking. Where do he go instead of where does he go? And those little bits of language are really important to tell us information about when something happened and how it happens. Again, children with typical language go through a phase where they leave off these endings, but children with DLD are in a prolonged period when they leave them off. And so they may not be using them through adulthood. And I want to tell you something a little tricky about what kids with DLD will do here is sometimes you may think, well, I never heard them say that, but actually I don't know that I hear them talk about it very often. And what we see is that our kids with DLD get really savvy in how to be successful in the language that they have. And so instead of using these forms that they maybe are not as confident about, or maybe that they have more trouble with, they'll instead just not use them at all. So instead of saying like, yesterday I walked to school, you may hear a lot more things like I was walking, because maybe they're more comfortable with the phrase like I was walking, but not so comfortable with I walked. So sometimes it's not that you'll hear the errors that kids make, it's you'll hear that they'll never even try a grammatical structure that can be your insight into the fact that kids are maybe less comfortable with a certain part of grammar. Again, I want to just reiterate something I said earlier, which is that this is only a symptom of DLD when this pattern is not dialect appropriate, because leaving off some of these word endings is in fact appropriate for many dialects of English. In addition to what kids say when they're using language, we also find that kids with DLD have particular difficulty understanding some of these more complex parts of language and grammar. So we may find that kids can't follow complex sentences. So if I said something like, after school, go home and put your backpack away, they may have trouble understanding that nice, long, complex sentence with the after in there because the grammar is just too heavy at hard of a level. And what that looks like is it may look like non-compliance, like a child not putting their backpack away, but it could be because they just can't follow the language that you used because it's a really complex language structure. So again, these things are going to show up in a number of different ways throughout their development, where maybe it's easier with some constructions, and then as language gets harder and you're seeing more complex grammar, more complex language use is when the language system starts falling apart. Moving on to discourse, when talking about discourse here, I'm referring to connected speech of more than one sentence that is used to communicate an idea or thought. Discourse could show up like conversation. Discourse could also show up like a child monologuing or telling you a story, or writing a story if we're in the world with written language. And what we see here is that for children with DLD, we find deficits spanning spoken discourse and comprehension of discourse. Children with DLD may have trouble understanding discourse, particularly when they're required to make inferences or understand abstract or figurative language. The reason being, so if I said something like, if you use a phrase, this is like it's raining cats and dogs, children with DLD will have particular difficulty with something like that because they have that single meaning attached to a word. And they have more trouble understanding that words can carry more than one meaning, or if it's not literal language. Difficulties making inferences, if you think back to when you were in school and using context clues, to try to figure something out in a story, they're going to have more difficulty with that if the answer isn't given to them directly in the discourse, in either the spoken discourse and what they've read, because they can't use language in a way that's not directly giving them the information. So they may have trouble reading between the lines, so to speak. Discourse may be out of order or disjointed. So I think we've all probably heard a young child tell you a story, and then that story is just coming out all over the place. So it's going to be like, this morning I woke up and I got breakfast, and then the dog had to go out, and for breakfast I had cereal, and then I put on my clothes, but my cereal bowl was empty, and I put my socks on, and they're all over the place with their story. And that's a normal part of a child learning how to tell a story and learning how to use discourse in order. The children with DLD will stay in that period for a longer period of time. So they're going to have a prolonged difficulty with discourse, with telling stories. We also see this in conversational turn taking and maintenance. So this would show up as something like if I said if you're having a conversation with a child, and if I said something like, what did you do today? And they said, oh, I went to school. How was school? And then maybe they veer off on topic and they're somewhere else. And it could be because they have difficulty following the language. If I say, how was school? What did you do at school? What happened after you went to lunch? I'm using more complex questions. I'm giving them something a little more challenging and linguistically to follow. And so they may not be able to follow it and respond appropriately in your conversational turn or in maintaining a conversation. And so these are things that we'll sometimes see, and it can be hard to parse apart why conversations are breaking down, because there are a lot of different reasons a conversation could break down for a child. But one consideration could be discourse, is that they just have trouble using language at that higher level and that more complex level of the back and forth conversation. While reading and writing are not included in the major parts of when we're talking about natural language development, reading and writing are considered secondary aspects of language and are influenced by every part of language that I mentioned so far. So if we think back, phonology is going to impact reading and writing, like I said at the beginning, because if you don't understand how sounds work within words, then it'll be hard for you to learn that a sound corresponds to a letter, and it's going to be hard to learn how to read and then hard to learn how to write. For vocabulary, if you don't have a good grasp of the meaning of a word, or if you don't have a lot of words in your vocabulary, then you aren't going to be able to understand what it is that you've read. Similarly for grammar. So for grammar, the same breakdown could happen. If a child doesn't have a great understanding of syntax or the sentence level grammar, or they don't understand how morphology works at the word level grammar, then when they're reading that information, they're not going to be able, they don't have that foundational understanding of how that part of language works to then apply to a reading or writing context. So what we do see is that reading often parallels language comprehension deficits. So what I mean by that is that if a child can't understand what I'm saying when I'm speaking, they're not going to be able to understand it if they've read it either. Now, this is separate from reading at the word level. And this is a distinction that I think is important because there are a few different ways that reading can break down with kids. One could be that they can't understand the reading information because they have trouble reading each individual word. And that is commonly referred to as dyslexia. And we definitely see that. And that isn't necessarily what I'm talking about here, because you have to consider what is the barrier to reading success. If the barrier to reading success is that I can't read the words, for instance, the ones on the screen, often parallels language comprehension deficits because I can't produce them, I can't find those sounds, I can't actually read the words, and you're never going to be able to understand what that means. For kids with DLD, if they can read those words out loud and maybe they sound perfectly fluent and fluid when they read them out loud, but their problem is not that they can't read the words, it's that they can't access the vocabulary and the grammar to understand what it is that they've just read. So it can be kind of tricky because at first glance, when you hear them read out loud, it may sound very nice, fluid, no trouble reading the individual words. But if you ask comprehension questions, particularly tricky ones that require inferencing, why questions, for instance, that is going to be where you're going to break down. The other way to tease these two things apart is that if a child who can't read the words themselves, if I read the story to them and ask comprehension questions, they should be able to be successful, because their barrier to reading success is that they can't actually read each word. For a child with DLD, if I read the passage out loud to them, they're still going to have trouble answering the comprehension questions, because their barrier to reading success is that they can't access the grammar and the vocabulary to understand what was read. So we see that kids with language comprehension deficits almost always also have reading comprehension deficits. And like I said, this will show up usually as difficulty answering questions about what was read. If you don't understand what was read, you can't answer questions about what was read. I tell my college students that all the time. If you don't understand it, you're not going to be able to answer questions about it. As I mentioned in the past, these kids are going to have difficulty making inferences. So those are going to be those why questions. So maybe they read a short story and you can say, well, when did it happen? Well, maybe in the story we said yesterday or Wednesday. Where did it happen? Maybe in the story we said at the park in San Diego. But if you say, why did something happen? That usually requires some higher level of thinking and inferencing and piecing together language. And our kids with DLD are more likely to break down there because it's not as explicit what that means. And like I said, in other areas of language as well, they're going to have more difficulty understanding figurative or abstract language, where there's not that one-to-one correspondence between the words and the grammar and what it actually means. So like I said, we have a difference between the language comprehension that we see in kids with DLD and then the word level reading, which usually occurs with the diagnosis of dyslexia. That doesn't mean that they can't co-occur, meaning that we do have a good portion of kids who have both DLD and dyslexia. So we don't want to rule out just because DLD just because a child has a dyslexia. It's altogether possible that a child could carry both diagnoses. The other thing is that for a lot of our kids with DLD is that some of these challenges in learning how to read aren't going to affect them at the early stages of reading. So it may be in kindergarten, first, second grade, when they're in the learning to read stage, and it's really focusing on those word level reading, that they're actually fine and they're tracking at age level, grade level expectations. But once you get into third grade and above, where we shift from learning to read to reading to learn, and the response, the heavy lifting is on reading in order to learn and on the language system of reading, that's where we may see our kids with DLD fall apart. So that's another thing to consider, is that since it is a lifelong disability, like I talked about in the very beginning, we can't rule out a child from having DLD just because they're successful in the early years of life or they're in the early years of education. We may not diagnose a child with DLD until they're later on in their educational journey. And the last part of my garden is writing. And like reading, writing often also parallels spoken language deficits. So for kids who have trouble with writing specific sounds, they're going to have, with producing specific sounds because of phonology, they're going to have trouble writing those sounds. If they have trouble when you're talking about writing passages, not writing individual words, but when we're talking about writing in passages, we're going to see errors in grammar and vocabulary that are the same types of errors in grammar and vocabulary that they're going to say when they speak to you in conversation. We will often see some trouble with spelling because, again, that breakdown could be at that fine-tuned level of the language system. And then when children are writing in narratives or in passages, we see difficulty organizing paragraphs, both within paragraphs and between paragraphs for longer writing samples. And this may parallel spoken discourse. So if children are making a lot of errors in their spoken discourse and telling you a story and it's disjointed and it's all over the place, then you're going to more likely see the same things in a longer written passage. Like reading, these deficits may not appear until the later school years. So we can't expect them to see them right away when they're just learning how to write. So I'm going to pause for a second because I just gave you a lot of language heavy information using a lot of language heavy language about some of the things that we see in DLD. And I wanted to see if there are any questions about this before I keep going.
My question, Allison, is In this analogy of the flower garden, do you see that these areas tend to develop independently, or there's just to be overlap in the challenge areas?
Great question. And it could be anything. So we could have kids who have, okay, so it could be anything, but I would say that as a child develops, they're going to bleed into each other. So let's say that we have a child with a really good phonological system, which means that when they start producing language and they start speaking, they have no difficulty with the individual sounds of language. That's great. Then they're not, that is going to be an area where they're relatively intact. And then maybe they start producing vocabulary late, and then we see that they have a lot more trouble learning new vocabulary. They're not learning vocabulary at the rate as their other peers. That will downstream have impacts on discourse on reading and writing, because if they don't have the vocabulary system to support longer passages, longer conversations, discourse, etc., that doesn't necessarily mean that they will also have grammatical deficits, but it's hard to tease apart because it's hard to use a grammatical sentence when you don't have a really good foundational vocabulary. So there may be overlap in these areas, but as kids get older, it's really hard to, you really have to do a deep dive and figure out what is the underlying problem that is usually having this downstream effect on all these other areas of language where it's popping up in all these other areas. And that is often why, if we go back to the terminology that I presented at the beginning, we see these kids end up with diagnoses of specific learning disability, especially if they're in schools, especially if they're diagnosed later in their educational career, because at that point, language deficits are impacting everything that they're doing. It's impacting reading, writing, it's impacting math, because if you think about way math as science is taught, is it's taught through language. Kids are reading in order to learn science. They're reading in order to learn math, or those dreaded word problems, which are usually very grammar heavy. If you have some word problems, like if Ricky has 17 bananas and Alyson wants 10 bananas and Jeff wants 12 bananas, who has the most amount of bananas? And that's one sentence. That's actually a very heavy grammatical load for our kids. And so it may look like they're struggling in all areas, but a deep dive into their system could show that the underlying root of it is a linguistic deficit.
Another question, the question is about treatment, I think resources for a child that has DLD and potentially dyslexia.
Mm-hmm. Was just kind of, I went to the wrong place. Kind of
a general question of what's the best treatment or resources and things like that.
Yeah. So for DLD and dyslexia, depending on if the child is in the schools and receiving school services or outside of the schools and receiving other services, for a kid with both, I would say as much as possible, a dual approach of a reading specialist and a speech language pathologist is going to be a really good bet, because both reading specialists and speech language pathologists bring different skills to the table. The speech language pathologist can get at the underlying root of the language system and what could have what could be impacting reading at a higher level, but the reading specialist is also going to be able to really fine-tune intervention and treatment for aspects of the reading system and aspects of reading pertaining to education that speech language pathologists don't have access to. So that's, in an ideal world, that's what you're going to get the most. In some public schools, if kids are in public schools, they're more likely going to see a reading specialist, but reading specialists do a lot of really good work with kids with language-based reading impairments. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, I think that's, it does. I missed the second part of it where this kid also has speech therapy, and I'm not sure how that fits in with what we just said.
Yeah, so I would definitely, as much as you can bring in a speech language pathologist through speech therapy in order to help with reading, I would bring them in, because speech language pathologists are trained in all of these areas of language that I have up on this screen, and in fact, in more. So I don't have pragmatics up there. I didn't separate out morphology and syntax, but speech language pathologists are trained in each one of those areas in depth. And so having a speech language pathologist who can work within that, and also if the kid is receiving services for speech sound difficulties, being able to work within those two complementary but still distinct systems of speech and language is a skill set that the speech language pathologist has that somebody like a reading specialist may not have.
Thanks, Allison. Any other questions right now?
All right, shall I go on? Okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit about causes of DLD, but the reality is that I can't because we don't have one known single cause of DLD. There appears to be a genetic contribution to DLD, meaning it's be more likely to see language difficulties in a child if a parent has had it or in siblings. And the belief is that, like I mentioned at the beginning, DLD is neurodevelopmental, meaning there are differences at the level of the brain. But the reality is that we don't have one clear cause of DLD. There's no gene for DLD. There's no brain injury that causes DLD. There is just it is the most common neurodevelopmental language disorder that no one has ever heard of. So instead, what I'd rather do is tell you what does not cause DLD, because I find that for parents, this can often calm a lot of fears. Because when I'm working with families, what I hear a lot is a lot of blame and a lot of what did I do? If I did this differently, would this have happened? And the answer to that is nothing. You've done nothing. You could not have done anything differently. So what does not cause DLD? Growing up multilingual. This is a huge misconception that speech language pathologists, and especially us at San Diego State, are really trying to get rid of. And we have parents who are, let's say, an example of families who speak Spanish as their home language, and when their child is having difficulty learning, and maybe they're speaking Spanish and English at home, and when their child is having difficulty acquiring their first language, they say we should make it easier and get rid of one language, and they get rid of Spanish. And we would, if I was in their ear, I'd be saying, please don't do that, because being exposed to multiple languages is never going to cause DLD. And we always want to promote the home language, the language families use, and just giving the child a really robust linguistic system. So growing up multilingual definitely does not cause DLD. I had a mom in my lab crying once because she said, I put him in an immersion school. And I said, that did not do anything. I can assure you that did not cause DLD in your child. So keep speaking those languages if you have multiple languages. Differences in how parents talk and read to their children. There's is also hopefully going away, but a misconception is if I didn't talk to my child enough, or if I didn't read to them enough, then their language isn't good enough. And it often comes hand in hand with my next bullet point, which is a belief that lower education or lower socioeconomic status causes language disorders or causes language deficits. And again, I really want to put that one away. We are trying also as a field really hard to say, coming from a lower education background, coming from a lower socioeconomic status background, lower income background, not reading 30 minutes to your child every night does not cause developmental language disorder. It is a neurodevelopmental disorder. Any race or ethnicity. There is no race or ethnicity that is more inclined to have a DLD diagnosis. This is a disorder that affects people from all races and ethnicities. In attention or behavior difficulties, we may see attention or behavior difficulties come hand in hand with DLD. It is common for kids with DLD, especially young kids, to have concomitant behavior difficulties. And if you think about it, it makes sense. If you were 2, 3 years old and you had wants and needs and you couldn't express them because you don't have the language to do so, even older kids, you are more likely to throw a tantrum, to use behavior in a way that is maybe not, maybe a little bit more on the negative behavior side. But usually for kids with DLD, these kids are doing it because they're trying to express their wants and needs, but they can't because they don't have the language to communicate what they want to. And so it shows up as attention or behavior difficulties. So it may be co-occurring or concomitant, but it's not causal. Attention or behavior deficits do not cause DLD. Laziness. That's another misconception. This one, thankfully, is on its way out, I think, is, oh, my kid doesn't talk much because they just are lazy and they don't want to talk. And usually our answer to that is, a kid could be lazy, which is not always a bad thing, but it's not going to cause them to not develop language. Not developing language in a normal trajectory is going to be caused by something else. And the same thing with shyness. And that's another job that an SLP often has to do. And that really talking to parents is where we get a lot of that information is your child not speaking in class? Is your child not speaking to the SLP because they're shy or because they don't have the language to use in those contexts, and really kind of teasing apart the why there, but that's not going to be the cause of DLD. Before I do my thank you, I meant to switch the order of these slides and I forgot. I put these up as QR codes, but they're also hyperlinks because I wanted you all to have resources. The first one I really wanted to show, is it okay if I do this, Ricky?
Oh yeah, of course, please.
This is a resource that I mentioned from Jean Tai, and it is a Developmental Language Disorder, a guide for parents and families, and it is a free downloadable book. And I love this resource. And I will also send this to Ricky and everybody to share, but this way you can access it. Both what I love about this resource is it's a lot of repetition of what I've already said, which is great. But also it's going to give you ways to talk with kids about your children, about their DLD. Let me blow this up a little bit. Talking with others about your child's DLD, building language learning into your life, supporting your child's communication at home, what DLD looks like at school, how DLD can impact friendships, and even for adults with DLD. So I think that this is just a really important resource and one that all parents should have. The next one, where did it go? I lost my slides. Hold on, sorry. Is Rattled. So Rattled is raising awareness of developmental language disorder, and this is the international group. But there's also the one that I have bookmarked here is the US branch of raising awareness of DLD, or Rattled. It gives contact information for the national committee, information and resources, upcoming DLD events. And it's really nice to have this information and then all these other resources. So you've got DLD and Me, I think, is on my list. DLD, this is the same resource that I just had you at, the Guide for Parents and Families, DLD FAQs for families, empowering speech language pathologists, etc. So that's another amazing resource. And then the last one that I wanted to share is a link tree. Oops, I lost it. There it is. There we go. This is from Rattled as well, Think Language, Think DLD. And so this will take you specifically to different links about teachers' perspectives on DLD, raising awareness, DLD and Me, the DLD project, engage with DLD, etc. Free modules, fact sheets, documents for families, FAQs for parents and caregivers, specifically about multilingualism, guides for teachers, for speech language pathologists, including some really nice free resources. Some podcasts about DLD. I'm telling you, this is about everything one could ever want about DLD, and one wonderful link tree. So one of the big things, again, that we're trying to do here is raising awareness, but also raising awareness in a way that is helpful for parents and families, because that's our ultimate goal. And for kids, we want kids to be able to talk about the difficulties that they have as well, because I think that that's really empowering for kids. I do need to obviously give my thanks to my lab, the Language Learning Lab, to the College of Health and Human Services, and to the School of Speech, Language, and Hearing Sciences at SDSU, and to Brain Balance for having me to talk about my favorite thing. And I did leave a few minutes for other questions if they come up, and always ending with our Rattled slogan, Think Language, Think DLD.
Yeah, thank you, Alyson. So we do have another question. I think you kind of pointed to a lot of resources already, but can you specifically speak to if someone is homeschooling their kid, any of those resources that can be helpful with, curriculum, maybe with DLD in mind, that kind of thing?
That's a great question. I don't know that anybody has curriculum specifically for homeschooling, although we should. That is something we should put on our to-do list. But I think that if you look in the research literature, what we're seeing more, and what people are putting out there, is a lot more of guides for. There's a lot more collaboration between speech language pathologists, especially research SLPs, and teachers. and things that we think that teachers can do to support and SLPs can do in the classroom to support kids. And I think that a lot of the what we're trying to do as a field is we're trying to put strategies out there that anyone can pick up and use, because we think that not always useful to have a huge amount of specific training to do an intervention correctly. And so what we as a field are trying to do is to say, here are some techniques that anyone can pick up and use and be successful in supporting kids. And so I would think that if you were able to look at some of these resources and find like strategies for SLPs, you should be able to understand and translate a lot of that work into homeschooling. But I'm also going to rack my brain and think about if someone is actually doing homeschooling curriculum, because that would be something that I feel like could find out the answer to, is if that is existing.
Yeah, and of course, if you think of it tomorrow or the next day, Alyson, we can always include this. We'll definitely post this webinar on YouTube, so we can link to all that later on as well.
Yeah, great.
But I really appreciate what the last part you said, because like at Brain Balance, we don't have this super specialized knowledge, but we're really diving into the tools and different strategies that we can help, right? As one piece to that puzzle of helping kids develop their language better or faster, or all of the above.
Yeah, I think that there's this when we're dealing with a lifelong disorder, right, with kids who are not going to grow out of something, it's really less of a what's a quick fix. And there are some areas in speech language pathology where we can make a lot of ground. A lot of that is that early when I talked about the speech sounds. So producing R's, for instance, is we can often help get some of that speech sound work up and running of kids who are just having difficulties in speech sounds, and maybe we able to fix it. And so then they're going to move on. I saw a speech language pathologist when I was younger for a lisp, and did a couple months, was able to fix that and go on. And then there are areas of our field that are going to be less how to fix it and more how to provide kids with supports and strategies to be successful throughout the rest of their lives. And that's, I think, the world that we're living in here when we talk about DLD, is what tools can we work with kids on if they have trouble making inferencing? How do we teach them how to make inferences? How do we teach them how to go back and find that information in the text? Because we're not going to be able to solve their language problems. But realistically, our kids with DLD can be very successful. They go on, they get jobs, they get married, they move out, they have families. And so we can help work with them in ways to make sure that they have long-term success. We're just not going to be fixing them. So, again, I think that's where we maybe, as kids are older, we're removing the idea of the specialized training and more of adding the support system, and whatever the support system looks like. Oh, good. I'm glad you're going to look at the resources. I put the chat up. I got excited, Ricky. Sorry.
No, you're good. Yeah, and I was just responding to a direct question. Kind of the last chance. Any questions for Alyson right now? She's still here with us on this call. All right. Alyson, thank you so much for your time. This has been informative for me, and of course, I can't wait to connect after the call and just continue to learn more about how to support all our kiddos.
Yeah.
To everyone else here, we're going to send the resources, not only this webinar, but I'll include the link tree too in an email, just so I can have it directly in their inboxes.
Great. And then if I can pull together anything else, I'll also send that to you all. And then, come visit us at San Diego State. This is how most of us spend our days.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, Alyson. Have a good night.